I have been planning to teach today what is perhaps the most important lesson in the course, the Austrian theory of the cycle. Here you have an essential chart intended to represent the extremely complex structure of productive stages, which emerges in a modern economy. Of course, it is impossible to represent our economy's productive structure using a chart, precisely because the structure is enormously complex. Nevertheless, we must make an effort to simplify it. As we will see together, this graphic illustration can help us understand many fundamental ideas of the theory of the cycle and of capital theory. Also, its use is long-standing in economic science. Economists from Jevons to Hayek, including Böhm-Bawerk, have used charts like this one to depict the productive structure. So, now I will explain what this chart consists of, so you can all begin to understand it. We will go step by step. To begin with, I want to make it clear that all the figures in this chart are in monetary units. That is, they are values expressed in monetary units. Also, in a way, the chart reflects Menger's conceptualization of the production process. Remember that Menger used the term economic goods of first order to refer to those goods which directly satisfy human needs. In other words, goods which correspond to the end an action is meant to achieve. The final stage the actor seeks to pass through, and he described as economic goods of second order, or third or fourth, etc. Those intermediate stages the actor must go through before he achieves his end. The higher the order, the further the stage is from the much-desired final consumer good. Well, here I have assumed, in order to simplify matters, that the production process comprises 5 stages, each of which lasts 1 year. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, and so on. At the left-hand side of the chart, we see that there are 2 possible ways of interpreting it. There is the diachronic view, which depicts 5 successive stages. Note that the stage corresponding to the first year, and the shortest bar above, is the stage furthest from the final consumer good. We will suppose that this stage corresponds to the extraction of iron ore from mines. So, in this stage, there are a number of mining companies which extract ore. They must pay their workers, and that is what the arrow pointing up to 18 indicates. The companies pay 18 monetary units to workers and owners of the original means of production. For example, they pay rent on plots of land where mines are located. Then, the companies sell the iron ore for 20 units. This is what this initial stage reflects. So, clearly, if I am the owner of a mining company, and I have incurred costs of 18 units, and I sell for 20, I obtain a profit of 2 units, which we see indicated by an arrow pointing to the right of this initial stage. You see it here, 2 units. If at the beginning of the year I invest or advance to workers 18 units, and in exchange the workers transfer to me ownership of the product, the iron ore extracted, and I sell it for 20 units at the end of the year, I obtain a profit of 2 units. As you already know, that accounting profit is a manifestation of the gross market interest rate, plus or minus pure entrepreneurial profits or losses. If we suppose these to be absent, then 1 year after investing 18 units, I recover the 18 units and receive 2 more, which would mean an interest rate of 2 divided by 18, approximately 11%, as I explained to the right. Now the iron ore moves on to the next stage. To keep things simple, we will assume the next stage also lasts 1 year. In this second year, or successive stage, the iron ore goes through a transformation process. It is taken to a blast furnace, for example, where it is converted into steel. You see this second successive stage here. The bar is marked 40. We will understand where this 40 comes from right away. The companies which concern us here are blast furnaces. They must buy iron ore. they buy it for 20 units from companies operating in the previous stage. And blast furnace companies must also hire workers and other means of production. Notice the arrow pointing up. As you can see, they acquire 16 units worth. So, if I buy iron ore for 20 units, and then I pay the workers at my blast furnace 16 units, I am advancing a total of 36 units. But I sell the steel for 40. This means I obtain a profit of 4 units, as you can see from the arrow pointing to the right. 4 divided by 36, the amount I have advanced, equals another 11% profit. And we will imagine the process of production continues and enters its 3rd year, since we are following the diachronic outline. It enters its 3rd year. Well, imagine the steel is purchased by a number of car manufacturers and enters the assembly line. The car companies sell the cars for 60 units, but they have had to buy steel for 40, and they have also hired workers and have paid them 14. 40 plus 14 is 54. They sell the cars for 60 units and make a profit of 6, which is also more or less 11%. And that takes 1 year. Then another year is spent distributing the cars to different countries, transporting them, etc. This would be the 4th year of the production process. And as you can see, the final value of its product is 80 units, which includes the 60 units which the dealerships, etc. pay the car manufacturers. They pay them 60. And the dealerships also have personnel, etc., whom they pay 12. See the arrow pointing up. So, 12 plus 60 equals 72. They sell the cars for 80 units and obtain a profit of 8. And now we come to the final stage, the last one, and that is the stage of final distribution, when the product reaches the consumer. Think of advertising campaigns in newspapers, on radio and TV, in movie theaters, stands at trade fairs. In this last stage, the 5th year, the final consumers, you and I, buy the cars, and we pay 100 units for them. That is what is spent on final consumption. Thus we read at the bottom of the chart, final consumption equals 100 monetary units of net income. We purchase automobiles as consumer goods for the amount of 100 units. Those who sell them to us have incurred costs of 80 units plus the 10 they have paid their workers, so 90 in total, and they make a profit of 10 monetary units. Well, we can conceptualize the productive structure from a diachronic point of view. That is, one stage after another. Hence, from the time the car is designed and the iron ore is extracted, until the car has been produced and is handed over, along with the keys, to the customer, 5 years pass. However, we can also interpret the productive structure from a synchronic point of view. In contrast to diachrony, synchrony refers to a sort of snapshot. If at this moment we take a photo of the productive structure, we find that right now there are companies devoted to the extraction of iron ore. We do not know how this iron ore will ultimately be used. It may be turned into vehicles, or ships, or metal structures within 3, 4, or 5 years. We do not know, but today there are companies devoted to that stage. And from the synchronic viewpoint, we call it the 5th stage. Why? In honor of Menger. Remember that Menger used the term economic goods of higher order to refer to those goods distant from the final stage of consumption. And the further away the stage, the higher the order. Well, 5th order goods, goods from the 5th stage, are the furthest from consumption. If today we take a sort of snapshot of the productive structure, in synchronic terms, we see that today numerous companies are also devoted to treating the iron and converting it into steel in blast furnaces. These companies are in the 4th stage. They are producing steel which in 4 years, not 5, will materialize into something, though we do not know what. For instance, the steel might become a tower crane, or a tank, or an industrial vehicle. And today there are also companies devoted to the 3rd stage, and the production of all sorts of 3rd-order economic goods. which will mature in the form of consumer goods in 2 years. In addition, today there are many companies devoted to the second stage, that is, the stage just prior to final consumption. For example, the suppliers of the Corte Inglés, manufacturers of fabrics, shoes, etc., which are sold to the Corte Inglés. These companies are in the second stage today. Their contribution to the production process will mature in the form of consumer goods in 1 year. And finally, today, a constellation of companies are also devoted to the first stage, the stage of first-order economic goods, consumer goods, the stage which is in direct contact with customers. For instance, the Corte Inglés or the dealerships which sell the cars. Together they sell their products for a total of 100 monetary units. So, take note. We can track the production of the car from the time it is designed and the iron ore is extracted until the car is handed over to the customer 5 years later. We can also take a snapshot of the productive structure today, this year, to get a simultaneous view of the workers and companies specialized in the fifth, fourth, third, second and first stage, the stage closest to consumption. In the future, when you finish your degree and go to work, you will start working at a company, most likely a company far from the stages in direct contact with consumption. Well, if you add up the amounts 20, 40, 60 and 80, you will see that the total is far greater than 100. In other words, the amount of human effort, or the number of workers and companies, and the amount of money exchanged in transactions between the stages prior to consumption far exceed the number of workers and companies and the amount of money exchanged in sales in the last stage, consumption. Well, of course, iron ore is extracted and then sold to the blast furnace, and the product is then sold to the next stage, and the next, and the next, and only at the end does consumption occur. It is important that, as economists, you visualize this. Generally, we have the idea that consumption matters most, and that it is the most important stage, and accounts for the largest part of income. This is utterly false. In modern economies, consumption accounts for no more than about 1/3 or 1/4 of all productive effort and all income spent. The vast majority of workers' productive effort and of income is involved in transactions in earlier stages, as this simplified outline of productive stages enables us to easily visualize. Note what is received by workers or owners of the original means of production. We add up the numbers in the little boxes at the top, 18 plus 16, plus 14, plus 12, plus 10. Workers receive a total of 70 units. Also, the capitalists of each stage obtain a profit, which we see in the boxes to the right. 2 plus 4, plus 6, plus 8, plus 10, a total of 30 units. The 70 units the workers receive and the 30 units of profit, or interest, the capitalists receive add up to 100 units of net income, which is precisely the amount spent on consumer goods. Do you see? So, when we talk about the concept of income, we must distinguish between gross and net income. In gross terms, the income which changes hands over the 5 years in the diachronic view, or in 1 year in the synchronic view, is equal to the sum of 20, 40, 60, 80 and 100, plus what is paid to the owners of the original means of production. The total is 370, and we will discuss it in a moment. That is the gross income, the amount that changes hands between all the intermediate stages up to the final stage. However, the income which reaches workers, other owners of the original means of production, and company owners, and which they spend on consumer goods, is called net income, and is equal to 100. Why is it called net income? Because it gives rise to consumer goods, and is spent on consumer goods. The transactions which take place between the different intermediate stages do not result in consumption, though they are part of gross income. We arrive at the gross monetary income for the period by totaling, in terms of monetary units, all the transactions from bottom to top which take place during that period. And in our example, that gross income amounts to 370 monetary units. of which 100 is spent on consumer goods. The other 270 is advanced to workers, owners of the original means of production, and suppliers of earlier stages, and is later recovered with a profit when the product is sold to the next stage during the same period. This is important. This triangular outline of the productive structure catches our attention and communicates an essential idea many economists have not understood well, not even Adam Smith, namely that the amount of money spent on production goods over any period of time far exceeds the amount of money spent over that same period on consumer goods and services. I want you to fully grasp this idea. I have already stated it, but I'm going to repeat it now. The amount of money spent acquiring factors of production between all the productive stages, for example, in the year 2009, far exceeded the amount of money spent on consumer goods. That is, the amount of money which, in the year 2009, in that business year, companies spent to buy iron ore, steel from blast furnaces, and factory robots to shape the steel, and the amount they paid the companies which put the cars together on an assembly line, the shippers that transported them, and the companies that developed the ad campaigns. All that was spent in all those intermediate stages far exceeded what was spent buying the cars sold in 2009. Our example makes that very clear. 100 is spent on consumer goods. In contrast, 270 is spent in the intermediate stages. Add up the numbers. Take care. This idea is essential. And, pari passu, at the same time, together, it is not only that the amount of money spent on productive factors in the intermediate stages far exceeds the amount spent on consumer goods. It is also that the entrepreneurial human effort workers put in is mainly concentrated in the stages of the productive factors distant from consumption. Only a small fraction of workers are devoted to the stage of consumption, sales clerks at the Corte Inglés, for instance. Now we are in a position to understand and criticize the figures of national income accounting. These figures are fraught with an enormous problem, namely that so-called national income figures, such as the gross domestic product, are not gross figures, even if that term is used to refer to them. Gross domestic product figures, which are used in national income accounting and by politicians and economists to gauge what is happening in a country, include only the final stage of consumption, that 100-unit stage, and a very small part of the stages above, the part which corresponds to capital goods that reach their end users. What I am telling you is extremely important. What I am saying is that national accounting figures, like the concept of national income or gross domestic product, exclude from their computation the largest part of the nation's productive effort, that devoted to the earlier stages in the production process. And why is that? Well, it is an excrescence. Excrescence is an elegant academic word meaning a morbid outgrowth, from the economic theory of Keynes, who was bent on exaggerating the importance of consumption. To give you an idea, consumption accounts for 70% of GDP. In other words, it is the largest sector. So, it is reasoned, consumption is essential. That is why Keynesian economists and macroeconomists in general believe that when things are going wrong, it is time to encourage consumption. This is a very grave error, because as we already know, the vast majority of the productive effort put in by all of us and by companies etc. is not found in the consumption stage, but in the prior stages, which do not enter into the calculation of national accounting figures. Another argument offered for doing things this way is that it is an attempt to avoid double counting. In other words, if a capital good produced in a certain stage is ultimately incorporated into a consumer good, then if the income of all stages is added up, values are added together, one after the other, in duplicate. That is, these economists use a value-added argument. They say, in computing the GDP, we need consider only the value added, because otherwise we would be doubling or exaggerating the amount of income. But this argument is not sound either, because the carburetor produced in the third stage this year, assuming the carburetor company operates in the third stage, will be incorporated into a Pegaso truck that will be sold 2 years from now. If we suppose that there are 5 stages lasting 1 year each, and that the carburetor is produced in the third stage, Then, the carburetors this company produces this year will finally be incorporated into consumer goods in 2 years' time. A Pegaso truck sold this year undoubtedly has a carburetor, but it is not one of those produced this year. Of course, the value of the Pegaso truck sold this year reflects the value of everything, the wheels, the carburetor, and all the rest. But the carburetor is not one of those produced this year. Those will end up in Pegaso trucks sold 2 years from now. Do you see? So the value-added argument is invalid. National accounting figures are misleading. At one stroke, they eliminate most of the human entrepreneurial effort which the country's workers put in. These figures concentrate solely on, and duly exaggerate the importance of, final consumption and the capital goods which reach the end user. Yesterday, when Jordi Franch-Parella was defending his doctoral dissertation, he compared the process of production with an iceberg. A person might focus only on the tip of the iceberg, which is above sea level, and say, that is consumption. Yes, but the social process of production is far more elaborate, and 4/5 of it is underwater and cannot be seen. The part underwater corresponds to the different stages further away from consumption. These stages provide jobs for most workers and entrepreneurs, and it is in these stages that the great expansions of the bubble period occur, as well as the great contractions which generate mass unemployment during the tightening period. The proof of this lies in the fact that Spain closed the year 2009 with a 3.5% drop in GDP. You may wonder how that can be possible. Do you know by how much the sales revenue of industrial companies from the stages far from consumption has fallen? 30%, not 3, 10 times more. If there had been only a 3% contraction in the economy, do you think the number of jobless people would have risen to almost 5 million? In fact, all of those unemployed people are from the stages far from consumption, the results of which do not enter into the computation of national accounting figures. Therefore, if we wish to have national accounting tools that enable us to analyze what is really happening throughout the cycle, it is vital that we replace the Keynesian concepts traditional up to now with others that include all the stages in the production process. In the outline of the productive structure we have just looked at, how much did economic agents, as consumers and entrepreneurs, spend on consumer goods? 100 monetary units. Well, let us suppose that suddenly, out of the blue, and to make this illustrative and eye-catching, everyone's time preference decreases. The intensity with which everyone values the present over the future decreases in relative terms. Therefore, people become willing to postpone the attainment of consumer goods, that is, the achievement of their much-desired ends, into a more distant future. Of course, other things being equal, we all invariably value the present over the future. What I am saying is that the intensity with which we value the present more than the future suddenly diminishes. And to make it quite clear, we will suppose that all of a sudden, instead of deciding to spend 100 monetary units on consumption, we decide to spend 75, and we decide to save the rest. We will suppose that economic agents suddenly decide to save 25% of their net income. In our example, we imagined they spent 100 units of their net income on consumer goods. So, now we will imagine they decide to save 25 and spend only 75 on consumer goods. Well, if this happens, 3 extremely important effects are exerted on the economy. We will consider them one by one. The first effect is that if we suddenly decide to consume less and spend 75 instead of 100, what do you think will happen to the sales of the Corte Inglés? They will go down. And what do you think will happen to the accounting profits of the companies closest to consumption? Will they thrive, or will they start to suffer and go into a spin? They will begin to decline. So, because an increase in saving means less consumption, it gives rise to an initial drop in the relative profits of the companies closest to consumption. Meanwhile, the profits of the companies furthest from consumption remain unchanged, since these companies are producing goods that will mature in 2, 3, 4, or 5 years' time. Do you see? So there is a disparity in profits. Do you remember that in the chart of the productive structure we have just studied, The rate of profit, or interest rate, though this is a rough, imperfect way of speaking, was the same over all the stages, 11%. That is a result of entrepreneurs' desire for profit. If they see that in one stage there is a lot of profit, and in another stage there are losses, what do? They abandon the less profitable stages and move to the more profitable ones. And what effect does that have? Well, when more is sold in the stages with large profits, prices fall, and profits decline. And when entrepreneurs abandon the stages with small profits, less is sold, and profits tend to rise. In other words, the very force of entrepreneurship, which fuels the search for profit, puts into operation a process of speculation and arbitrage, which tends to equalize profits over the different stages. If suddenly, out of the blue, people save more, this process begins to operate. The profits of consumer products companies fall, and the profits of the companies further from consumption rise in relative terms. Thus, the first effect reflects the essential role profits play in a market economy by guiding entrepreneurs in their actions. And what profits are saying to entrepreneurs is, ladies and gentlemen, you need to divert your efforts from immediate consumption, sales of consumer goods, the corte inglés, etc., to an area where more relative profits are being made, mining, blast furnaces, etc. In immediate consumption, profits have fallen because people have decided to consume less. This is the first effect, a disparity in profits, which is an essential sign to entrepreneurs and directs them in their actions. The message is, hey, what happened? People are deciding to postpone their consumption into a more distant future. You should devote your efforts to activities that will mature in a more distant future, because activities which mature today in immediate consumption are generating very little profit. This is what chart V2 describes. The final stage, at period T+1, is when consumption drops to 75 units. Note the profits at the right, and that profits in the stages far from consumption are much larger than those in the stages close to consumption. Remember that consumption and the companies devoted to the final stage of consumption represent only a small fraction, 1/3 or so, of all productive effort. These companies now slip into a decline because they are bringing in lower profits. And if the corte inglés is bringing in lower profits and selling less, do you think the company will hire more workers? Do you think it will lease or build more facilities, etc.? No, quite the opposite. The owners of companies close to consumption will have to tighten their belts. And to keep their companies profitable, they will have to free up labor, stop hiring, or lay off workers. Because they have fewer sales, they must draw back, contract, and they free up productive factors, workers and labor. Where do these workers and that labor go? They are demanded and placed precisely in the stages furthest from consumption, the stages with the highest relative profits, where entrepreneurs redirect their investment efforts. In fact, if something characterizes the whole process of economic development, it is that a lower and lower percentage of workers are devoted to consumption, and a higher and higher percentage are devoted to the stages furthest from consumption. In India, where capital equipment is lacking and people harvest by hand or use a Roman plough, everyone is very close to consumption and very poor. In the United States, in Switzerland, and in Spain, a much higher percentage of people are devoted to the stages furthest from consumption. Incidentally, if I am an entrepreneur and I decide to disinvest in consumption and the corte inglés and to invest in computers or blast furnaces or telecommunications, then when I invest in computers, blast furnaces and telecommunications, those companies distant from consumption demand labor. If, as an entrepreneur, I redirect my investment efforts to the stages furthest from consumption, telecommunications, computers, blast furnaces, those companies are going to demand more labor and productive factors to expand their facilities. The goods they are producing are not for immediate use today, when consumption has dropped. They are producing goods for consumption in 3, 4, 5 years, or however many. Do you see? My question is, will those companies be obliged to pay higher wages and higher rents to attract factors of production? This is important. The answer is no, because even if they demand more, and that is a force to push wages up, it is no less true that the companies close to consumption free productive factors, so the supply of them increases. Therefore, there is a gradual restructuring. It takes place little by little, and is subtle but firm and sustainable. Consumption becomes less and less substantial in relative terms, and more of us, in relative terms, work in the stages far from consumption. And that is the firm, sustainable process of healthier economic development, which characterizes economic growth in any growing economy. Saving brings about a second effect, namely that, other things being equal, if we decide to save more, that is, to supply more present goods, what happens to the price of present goods in terms of future goods, which we call the interest rate? Well, people are obliged to pay a much lower premium because so many present goods are supplied, since the rate of time preference has decreased. And thus we are willing to give up consumption in exchange for a smaller gain or additional amount in the form of interest in the future. In other words, the rise in saving causes a drop in interest rates, and the interest rate is a price which is used to calculate the value at market prices of capital goods. Take a look at the financial mathematics formula. I am going to give you a simpler one. Let us imagine a very durable capital good, even one that will last almost indefinitely. For example, an apartment. An apartment is a capital good. We will imagine an apartment which every year brings in 1,000 euros each month. How much does it earn per year? 12,000 euros. Is that clear? Well, the present value of a rent over an indefinite period at interest rate I is equal to the rent divided by the interest rate. In our example, 12,000 euros a year. We will suppose that the apartment will last indefinitely. In practice, that does not happen. Goods wear out, and one must cope with depreciation, etc. And thus the formula is more complex, and you will find it at the bottom. We will suppose the interest rate is 10%. If the interest rate is 10%, the current value of that rent at 10% is 10 times the amount, 120,000 euros. That is what the apartment would be worth. Now, let us imagine people suddenly decide to save more, and as a result, interest rates drop to half, to 5%. What happens to the value of the capital equipment? 12,000 divided by 0.05. The rate has fallen from 10% to 5%. Well, it turns out that 1 divided by 0.05 is 20 times the amount, 240,000 euros. Note, the same capital good, the same property, plot, apartment, or, setting aside the differences, machine, computer, increases greatly in value as interest rates decrease due to a rise in saving. In fact, if the interest rate is reduced to half, the market value of the apartment doubles. Hence, the second effect is quite clear. The first one is obvious. If people save more, the profits of the companies close to consumption suffer and go into a spin, and profits are larger in the distant stages. Therefore, entrepreneurs who want to make a profit move to the most distant stages. Second, an increase in saving pushes down interest rates, and therefore the market value of the capital goods furthest from consumption shoots up. And that is another sign which indicates to entrepreneurs, hey, what you need to do here is devote your efforts to building apartments and producing computers, capital goods, because now their value is much higher, since the interest rate has fallen. And the same thing that happens to the price of capital goods happens to the price of securities that represent capital goods in stock markets. What is a stock? It is a security which represents partial ownership, ownership of a small part, 1 out of 10 million, for example, in a company. If that company operates in a stage far from consumption and interest rates have gone down, the value of the stock mushrooms. Whenever saving increases, a third essential effect, called the Ricardo effect, appears. This is the effect the increase in saving exerts on real wages. What happens if we suddenly decide to save more and therefore to consume less? What happens to the price of consumer goods? Does it tend to rise or to fall? It tends to fall. 1/4 of all consumer goods are left unsold. So the price of consumer goods falls because we demand less consumption, since we have decided to save more. And what if our wages remain the same, and yet consumer goods are priced lower and lower? That is, if in nominal terms we are paid the same quantity of euros each month, and yet bread, food, clothing and recreation, etc., cost us less and less. Something very similar is happening right now. What happens to real wages if we earn the same amount and what we buy costs less and less? Well, real wages rise. In other words, the increase in saving pushes up real wages. And if real wages go up, that is an essential sign which communicates to entrepreneurs in all stages that at the margin they should replace workers with capital equipment, since the cost of hiring workers has gone up. Now, labor is more expensive in relative terms because people are saving more. And it is more expensive in real terms because the prices of consumer goods have dropped. Therefore, at the margin, I must replace one worker with capital equipment. Suppose I was going to hire 3 workers. Well, I do not hire them. Or I buy a computer and hire only 1 worker. Or I lay off 4 workers and buy a tractor. Because with 1 worker and a tractor, I can do the same amount of work I was doing before with 4 employees. And so on. So, imagine, many workers at the margin are laid off. But who produces the new tractor? The new computer? Or the specific capital equipment which companies purchase to replace workers? Precisely the workers who have been laid off. Whenever saving increases, a third essential effect, called the Ricardo effect, appears. This is the effect the increase in saving exerts on real wages. What happens if we suddenly decide to save more and therefore to consume less? What happens to the price of consumer goods? Does it tend to rise or to fall? It tends to fall. 1/4 of all consumer goods are left unsold. So the price of consumer goods falls because we demand less consumption, since we have decided to save more. And what if our wages remain the same, and yet consumer goods are priced lower and lower? That is, if in nominal terms we are paid the same quantity of euros each month, and yet bread, food, clothing and recreation, etc., cost us less and less. Something very similar is happening right now. What happens to real wages if we earn the same amount and what we buy costs less and less? Well, real wages rise. In other words, the increase in saving pushes up real wages. And if real wages go up, that is an essential sign which communicates to entrepreneurs in all stages that at the margin they should replace workers with capital equipment, since the cost of hiring workers has gone up. Now, labor is more expensive in relative terms because people are saving more. And it is more expensive in real terms because the prices of consumer goods have dropped. Therefore, at the margin, I must replace 1 worker with capital equipment. Suppose I was going to hire 3 workers. Well, I do not hire them. Or I buy a computer and hire only 1 worker. Or I lay off 4 workers and buy a tractor. Because with 1 worker and a tractor, I can do the same amount of work I was doing before with 4 employees. And so on. So, imagine, many workers at the margin are laid off. But who produces the new tractor? The new computer? Or the specific capital equipment which companies purchase to replace workers? Precisely the workers who have been laid off. Now, for the sake of argument, let us suppose the Keynesians are right, and when things go badly, we must consume more and save less. We will follow the same reasoning as before, but in the opposite direction. Let us imagine that in the economy, consumption amounts to 75 monetary units. We will begin with the last productive structure, and suppose that politicians and Keynesians have convinced us. Our time preference increases, and instead of consuming 75 units, we decide to consume 100. Damn right, we have to consume, so the economy will flourish. If we consume 100, what do you think will happen to the sales of the Corte Inglés? They will mushroom. And the profits of the Corte Inglés? They will mushroom. That is the first profit signal. What will it be telling entrepreneurs? Do not invest in the distant stages, blast furnaces, design, computers. Instead, devote yourselves to immediate consumer sales, because that is where the demand is. In addition, if consumption goes up, and thus people save less, what will happen to interest rates? They will rise. And if interest rates rise, the present value of all capital goods and related stocks will be reduced to a fraction. What will this communicate to entrepreneurs? Do not invest in facilities, companies and projects. You are going to lose money because they are going down in price. Also, if consumption goes up, what will happen to the price of consumer goods? It will go up, right? Well, if nominal wages remain the same, what will happen to real wages if what we buy costs us more and more? Real wages will fall. And if real wages fall, what message will that send to entrepreneurs? You must replace capital equipment with workers. It is just like before, but the other way around. Do not demand a new furnace, a new computer, or a new tractor. Instead, try to achieve the same as before, but with more people. The demand for the products of the stages far from consumption will suffer, and the demand for labor will increase. As a result, a flatter productive structure, with fewer stages, will emerge. A productive structure with fewer stages is a poorer productive structure, which in the future will give rise to fewer consumer goods and services. And since monetary demand is higher, prices will rise even more. The result is that the Robinson Crusoe with the stick will become the Robinson Crusoe who picked berries by hand. We may earn a lot in monetary terms, but we will be much poorer. Growth in consumption makes society poorer and reverses the whole saving process we have studied. Such growth brings the productive structure closer to consumption, reduces the number of capital goods stages, and results in the production of fewer goods and services and the impoverishment of all citizens. Such is the case of an economy in regression. Well, now we have analyzed in terms of economic theory the effects of an increase in saving. It is time for us to take the next step. We will turn to page 347, and what is perhaps the most important section in the book, the effects of bank credit expansion unbacked by an increase in saving, the Austrian theory, or circulation credit theory of the business cycle. As you recall in Chapter 4, we learned that the fractional reserve banking system is able to create money substitutes, part of the money supply, in the form of deposits which are injected into the economic system as loans. Without anyone's having had to save anything first. When the banking system begins a process of credit expansion, and thus injects loans into the economic system, banks also begin a process in which they temporarily lower interest rates, so entrepreneurs will accept the loans. Banks woo entrepreneurs and try to entice them to request loans. We have all witnessed this process in past years. Banks have pursued us to give us loans. This is how money is injected into the economic system. Remember that only around 10% of the money supply is in the form of cash. The other 9/10 exist merely in the accounting entries which banks make in the loan-to-deposit process. Well, initially, artificial credit expansion, unbacked by saving, generates a flow of new loans, which produces effects very similar to those we have just considered in the case of saving. In other words, with that new capacity to acquire factors of production at lower interest rates, and under easier loan conditions, entrepreneurs rush to invest because they believe in the profitability of those lower interest rates of projects they have had in their portfolios and have not yet launched for fear they would be unprofitable. Furthermore, when entrepreneurs are granted a loan, they do not know if it derives from a genuine increase in saving or merely from artificial credit expansion brought about by the banking system. In any case, when the banking system artificially reduces interest rates to convince entrepreneurs to request bank loans in the credit expansion process, the present value of capital goods rises, though temporarily. And entrepreneurs think they should tackle new investment projects as if society's saving had increased, when in fact it has not, because now the process stems from mere credit expansion. When credit expansion takes place, clearly a process of severe entrepreneurial maladjustment or discoordination results. On the one hand, entrepreneurs rush en masse to invest in projects that will mature in a more distant future, because they are receiving easy loans at reduced interest rates. But, on the other hand, economic agents, families, households, have not decided to save more. They continue to consume at the same rate as before. How can entrepreneurs possibly rush to invest without any increase in saving? In the absence of an increase in saving, how can entrepreneurs possibly step up investment? They can do so because their projects are being temporarily financed by newly created money through a process of credit expansion, and that maladjustment, that widespread discoordination between investors, entrepreneurs, and savers who do not wish to save and continue to consume at the same rate as before, can last for months and can even stretch on for 2, 3, or 4 years. Moreover, for a period of time, it seems as if the productive structure could get longer and more capital intensive without any need of saving. Notice that in this chart, consumption is still 100 monetary units. No one has decided to save anything. Nevertheless, some new stages have appeared, the 6th and the 7th. What has happened to the interest rate? Look to the right. What is the interest rate? 4.1%. Banks have lowered the interest rate from 11% to 4.1%, precisely so they could grant people the newly created loans. How is it possible for 2 new stages to appear, and for the 3rd, 4th and 5th stages, right up to the stage before consumption, to become wider? Well, all of the money from this entire shaded part corresponds to the new deposits the banking system has created. There has been no saving. Economic agents have not decided to save more. They do not wish to postpone consumption. However, they have embarked on new investment projects, and they have widened the most capital-intensive stages, the furthest from consumption, merely with new money that has been created in the form of deposits through a simple accounting entry. Will such a thing be sustainable? Dear students, as intuition will certainly tell you, such a situation is unsustainable. In real terms, we go on consuming, and we do not wish to save. However, with tremendous optimism, entrepreneurs rush to invest because they are receiving easy loans at low interest rates. Money does not grow on trees. Sooner or later, the market, which is highly efficient in dynamic terms, will spontaneously trigger 6 microeconomic effects that will put an end to the whole process. We will now consider these 6 effects. What 6 microeconomic effects spontaneously and inevitably spring into operation in the market? and put an end to this euphoria or stage of artificial credit expansion ushered in by fractional reserve banking. The first effect, there is a rise in the price of the factors of production. You will recall that in the case of saving, I made a qualification. I said that when saving increases, the profits of the companies furthest from consumption increase in relative terms, that it is wise to invest there, and that those companies demand labor. I asked, will the price of labor increase? And the answer was no, because labor is freed from the stages close to consumption. However, now it is not freed from the consumption stages, because people continue to consume at the same rate as before. So now, the only way entrepreneurs can possibly attract factors of production to the stages furthest from consumption is to pay more for them, for labor and natural resources. So, the first effect observed in the market is a larger and larger rise in wages, and the price of the other original means of production, natural resources, raw materials, skyrockets. What happens to the price of raw materials right before the financial crisis? What happened a few years ago to the price of copper and oil? How high did it get? It went through the roof. This is the first effect. Resources are not freed, and there is much higher monetary demand for them. When the price of productive factors rises this much, it is the first warning sign to entrepreneurs, because they have carried out their studies and designed their entrepreneurial projects with a much lower cost in mind. Even so, due to the euphoria and the binge of the bubble period, this first wake-up call is not enough to halt the processes initiated, and a second effect appears temporarily. There is a subsequent sharp rise in the price of consumer goods. Why? Because the newly created money in the form of loans is injected into the system and lent to entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs demand labor, buy equipment, etc. In a second, third and fourth wave, the money reaches the pockets of consumers, and since they go on consuming at the same rate as before, and now they have much more money available to them, what happens to the price of consumer goods and services? As we do not reduce our consumption, and we have a lot more money, the price of consumer goods and services tends to increase. What did we see happen to the CPI a few years back? The prices of consumer goods in Europe, Spain, the United States, etc. began to soar. This was due, first, to an increase in the monetary income of the original means of production, and second, to the fact that when entrepreneurs demand productive factors for projects that will mature in a more distant future, there is a slowdown in the immediate arrival of consumer goods in the market. What happened during the euphoria period? It was impossible to even get a table in a restaurant. One had to make a reservation, and people would fight to get into a disco or to buy any consumer good. The arrival of consumer goods had slowed down, because many productive factors had been taken to more distant stages, and also there was a lot of monetary demand. It was the stage of euphoria, runaway prices, etc. Moreover, the increase in the prices of consumer goods gives the impression of entrepreneurial prosperity. It seems like anything can be sold at any price. There is artificial growth in profits, and this leads many people to increase their consumption even more. Damn, I'm practically a millionaire. I'm going to go on a cruise to the Caribbean or to Cancun, etc. Capital is consumed during the euphoria stage. There is a third effect as well. When the money reaches the pockets of consumers and they go on consuming at the same rate as before, and the price of consumer goods and services goes through the roof, what happens to the entrepreneurial profits of the Corte Inglés and the stages close to consumption? They go through the roof too. What sign does that send to entrepreneurs? It tells them that money is being made close to consumption, not in the stages distant from it, precisely where, a few months or years earlier, entrepreneurs insisted on launching investment processes with low-interest loans from the banking system. Doggone it, I took on a loan of 4 million euros, or of 40 million, or of 400 million, for this investment project in housing, and it turns out that now the place to make money is in consumption and the Corte Inglés, and nobody wants houses. What a mistake. This brings us to the fourth effect, the Ricardo effect, but in reverse. Well, the price of consumer goods is skyrocketing, since no one has decided to save. And after the third or fourth wave of newly created loans, everyone has more money. The prices of consumer goods and services are soaring, and if nominal wages do not change, real wages go down. And if real wages go down, what do entrepreneurs do? They stop demanding tractors, computers and blast furnaces, which is exactly where the new loans went, and they hire more labor. We need more shifts, turnos in Spanish. We've got to push harder and add more shifts. We need immigrants from North Africa, Latin America, wherever. Labor, and not capital equipment. Well, this is almost the last straw for entrepreneurs who have undertaken investment projects in the stages furthest from consumption. But there is a fifth effect, which comes as the final blow. Once the new money has been injected in the form of loans, interest rates return to their previous levels. In other words, they come back up and even reach higher levels than before. As you know, the gross market interest rate has three components: the natural rate of time preference, the risk premium, and the premium for expected inflation or deflation. If prices tend to rise, the interest rate will include a higher premium for expected inflation, that is, for the drop in the purchasing power of the monetary unit. Also, uncertainty rises, and there is an increase in the risk premium. Well, if interest rates rise, dear students, what happens to the present rate of all capital goods, to which entrepreneurs so eagerly devoted the loans? It drops by half. What is happening to the prices of all the apartments that have been built in error? They are falling now. Once the new loans have been granted, the interest rate, which was reduced to 4%, goes back up to 11, 12, or 13%. Many desperate entrepreneurs will not want to accept the harsh reality that they have committed a very grave error, and they will insist on finishing their apartments and completing their investment projects, and there will be a sort of battle for bank loans, which will cause interest rates to climb even more. Last, we come to the sixth effect, which is a combination of all the previous ones. Inevitably, heavy accounting losses end up appearing in the stages relatively more distant from consumption. Dear students, that is when the financial crisis hits, followed by an economic recession. It was the banks that granted the loans, and the value of the loans lies in the bank's assets. Now the market discovers that the vast majority of those investment projects are unviable and were undertaken in error. They are not generating profits. Therefore, banks' assets drop in value to a fraction of their former worth. Meanwhile, banks' liabilities, the deposits they created, remain the same. Overnight, it is discovered that the entire banking system is insolvent. It is bankrupt. That is what happened in the recent financial crisis. Note that the unfolding of events fits in perfectly with what we are explaining in theoretical terms, and a desperate effort had to be made to bail out the banks. The program in the United States provided $700 billion with which to buy toxic assets, that is, assets worth nothing, subprime mortgages, loans for unprofitable investment projects, etc. In Ireland, Portugal and Greece, all deposits were simply guaranteed, because if people had gone to withdraw their money and had found it missing, the monetary system would have collapsed, and we would have gone back to the cave period. This brings us to the beginning of the economic recession. The market eventually reveals the grave entrepreneurial errors committed and the urgent need for restructuring. What does this mean? Well, first, entrepreneurs must halt unprofitable projects. Second, they must liquidate them, as with any investment project undertaken in error. Third, they must salvage whatever they can. Fourth, they must withdraw productive factors and labor from the stages far from consumption, where they were taken in error due to loans without real backing. And they must transfer these resources to stages closer to consumption, which is where consumers, economic agents, want them to be. A massive readjustment of the productive structure is necessary, and we now find ourselves in just such a process of readjustment. It is precisely what the economic recession or depression consists of. Take note. We have arrived at a recession because of a lack of real saved resources which would have permitted the completion of investment projects. To put it another way, we have arrived at a crisis because of overconsumption and insufficient saving with respect to the style of production used, which called for much more abundant available saving, when this did not exist. Everything was financed with the artificial speculative bubble of credit expansion. Some people say the crisis arose due to overinvestment. That is incorrect. Ultimately, we can invest only what we have saved. The crisis arose because we invested poorly. Society's scarce saved resources were invested as if we had saved much more. Do you remember when I gave the example of Robinson Crusoe? And I said it was essential that he be able to coordinate well the present with the future. I asked, what happens if he makes a mistake in calculation? And with his basket of 5 days' worth of saved berries, he tries to build a blast furnace. And everybody said, what madness! After 5 days, he has done no more than lay the foundations, his hands are bloody, and he goes back to being the poor Robinson Crusoe who gathers berries by hand. Perhaps he is even poorer than before, because now his hands are bloody. Despite the obvious differences, the same is happening now in an advanced economy impacted by credit expansion. We have unwisely invested society's scarce real resources in goods people do not want. As a result, we are poorer. 1 million apartments nobody wants have been built, and they are built because banks lowered interest rates, even to negative rates in real terms, and the apartments are already there and cannot be restructured. We are stuck with that iron, those bricks, etc. Those workers who should have devoted their effort to profitable projects have devoted it to unprofitable ones. There is a widespread process of malinvestment, and entrepreneurs have been deceived and drawn into it by the credit expansion of fractional reserve banking. Society's savings can be invested well or poorly. In a free market economy without credit expansion or privileges, etc., savings tend to be invested well. However, if the essential signs entrepreneurs receive are distorted, then for very prolonged periods of time, savings can be invested poorly, and sooner or later, the market, which is very efficient, detects that. The market discovers the malinvestment and puts the economy back on a sound footing, initially via a financial crisis, and later an economic recession. Hayek and Mises each provide a very illustrative example. Mises says the current situation is very similar to that of a builder, who, misjudging the amount of materials available to him, uses them up completely in laying a building's foundations, and is forced to leave the building unfinished. Hayek talks about the imaginary inhabitants of a lost island, who, having undertaken the construction of a huge machine capable of satisfying all the needs of the population, exhaust their savings and capital before finishing it, and have no choice but to temporarily abandon its construction. Well, that is precisely what happens in real terms in an economy distorted by credit expansion. In the end, what do we have once the 6 effects have appeared? A much flatter economy. Following the crisis, we have a productive structure in which, because more money has been injected and the proportion devoted to consumption remains the same, consumption is much greater in monetary terms. Consumption is 132 units, but there are only 5 stages, not the former 7. And what has happened to everything in stages 6 and 7, and to the widened portions of other stages? That has all disappeared, because it is not profitable, and the workers have lost their jobs. In Spain, for instance, 5 million people are out of work, because they are on their way, so to speak, to being redirected to profitable stages. That is why it is so important that the labour market be very free and flexible, so that the readjustment, which inevitably follows the error, is as fast and as painless as possible. And now we will wrap up this chapter with the following reflection. At this point, we are in a position to grasp why it was not possible to ensure the withdrawal of fractional reserve deposits by applying the so-called law of large numbers. Private bankers and banking school theorists said, Look, with 10% cash backing, we can handle normal withdrawals of deposit and insure withdrawals. No. An insurance policy requires complete independence between the existence of the policy and the occurrence of the phenomenon insured against. That is why, for instance, there is no marriage insurance. What do you think would happen to marriages if couples could take out a policy, pay a premium, and if their marriage failed, receive €1 million each in compensation? As a married man, I will explain it to you. The success of a marriage lies in the constant daily effort and sacrifices of both spouses to make their life together work, and it is often hard, but you have to keep going. What do you think would happen if there were a €1 million insurance policy just in case things did not work out? Would that affect the behavior of the spouses? Of course. More than one would ditch the marriage before giving it a chance. As a result, the insurance itself would greatly increase the number of marriage disasters or separations. Why do you think it is impossible for an entrepreneur to purchase bankruptcy insurance? Someone could say, damn, the insurance companies are run by idiots. They sell fire insurance and life insurance. Why haven't they thought of bankruptcy insurance, especially now? Listen, a company gets off the ground thanks to the bold efforts of its owners, its soul, its entrepreneurs, who earn their bread every day by bargaining, negotiating with suppliers, and wooing customers. It requires a great deal of effort, and often owners have to know how to say no. One day, people will come to you asking for pay raises, people who need the money for their families, and you will have to say no. Do-goodism is appealing. What we entrepreneurs would like to do is say yes to everyone and raise workers' salaries, but we do not do it because we would go broke. We have to say no. How do you think I would behave as an entrepreneur if things were going badly and I had bankruptcy insurance coverage? Well, I would decrease my efforts to keep the company on a sound footing, and I would say yes many times when I should say no. Consequently, I would go broke. Imagine if taking out a fire insurance policy dramatically increased the number of fires. The same principle applies. The entrepreneurial processes of human action are not insurable because the very existence of the supposed insurance would condition our behavior. And in the sphere which concerns us, fractional reserve banking, deposit withdrawals cannot be insured by maintaining, based on alleged experience or the law of large numbers, a fractional reserve ratio of 10% or whatever. We have just shown that fractional reserves bring about the expansion of the money supply in the form of loans for which the collateral consists of newly created deposits. These loans are granted in the market at low interest rates, which lead entrepreneurs to commit errors on a massive scale. Sooner or later, due to the 6 microeconomic effects we have just studied, the market uncovers those errors and triggers a financial crisis at banks. People discover the crisis and go en masse to withdraw their money. It is the supposed insurance itself, the fractional reserve, which brings on the bank run or the financial banking crisis. So, we have demonstrated, in terms of economic theory, that the withdrawal of deposits cannot be insured without a 100% reserve ratio.